Okay. Verbal PIs, please. Thank you. In opposition's world, transgender rights died the moment the UK top court ruled that transgender women shouldn't be legally protected. And LGBTQ rights were overhauled when Hungary banned pride expression. Proposition is the only side that uplifted the silenced. Three things in case setup before I move on into two arguments. Firstly, on proposition, we believe that people have a right to disobey against unjust laws. This looks like two things. Firstly, the right to protest against unjust laws, like protesting against the capturing of Julian Assange, or two, the right to abstain from participating in unjust laws, like refusing to give out information to ICE officials about immigrants. What are unjust laws then look like under our side? We think that this looks like two things. One, that laws that violates the civil liberties of individuals for a cause that they do not deem justified. Do note, therefore, things like the Patriot Act, RICO laws, or other quarantine mechanisms are not part of this debate because widely society agrees that the cause of national security and healthcare is something that's important towards individuals. Two, this looks like unfair discrimination and the persecution of minorities that disregarded their civil liberties. Secondly, then, what is the world on opposition? We believe that it was a world where people didn't have the right towards disobeying unjust laws at all. They needed to prove to us why these alternatives will be better and why they would even exist in the first place, or else it would just be a world where all dissent is silenced. Thirdly, then, on the burden, we think that this debate uniquely exists in a world where all other mechanisms to safeguard against unjust laws have failed. Uniquely, they have to prove why under unjust laws, regardless on whether it is objective or subjective, opposition must support a world where citizens watch injustices unravel. We are unwilling to do so, and we believe that justice would always reign above. Two arguments then. Firstly, on why the right to disobey directly counters the power asymmetry between states, law enforcement, and civil society. Three things under this. Firstly, why does the social contract itself unfairly tips the balance between state and citizens towards the state uniquely? Three things. One is that the states have the right to exercise control over all aspects of our life. They're able to enforce the military to stomp out dissent. They're able to have control over the media to enforce ideologies that align themselves. They're able to have all personal information on citizens to uniquely crack down on you. But two, there's an ultimate ability to hold states accountable. All of those things are reactionary. Election cycles only happens 4 years, but even in that process, there's no full access towards any of these mechanisms because power apparatuses and state power allows them to consolidate power in a way that is unfair. You're able to stamp out dissent. You're able to unfairly target oppositional parties that locks them out of access towards any forms of going against the state. Therefore, we must preserve the right to go against law enforcement at the baseline level so that there's always safeguarding towards the civil liberty of individuals and their ability to go against the government. But three, we have the social contract is arbitrary because citizens never consented to being born into the social utility machine of the government and whatever ideals that they had. Therefore, it was unjust to say that we should take away all of their rights just because the social contract existed. Secondly, what are unjust laws uniquely the tipping point towards that state power principle? Two things. Firstly, the formation of unjust laws is symptomatic of state failure because sometimes when states deliberately lock out people from check and balance mechanisms, like how Jim Crow laws disallowed Black individuals to even participate in the process of check and balances because they were unable to vote, means that these states have already failed us to begin with. And the state had the ability to lock individuals out of these check and balance mechanisms and lock them out of the proper access of the social contract. But two, we think that it already goes against civilian interests. What we'll prove here is that the social contract has already been broken the moment unjust laws were passed, and therefore we should always preserve the ability to disobey. The state power is only granted when it is used to serve the interests of the people. Insofar as unjust laws go against the fundamental values that individuals stood for on the ground, we believe that the ability and the right to protest against it should always be upheld. Thirdly, then, what is the weighing here? We think that social utility is always going to be a priori to the right to disobey under our side. This is uniquely why we don't allow things like slavery, even if it is the most utilitarian mechanism in terms of the economy and uplifting individuals through the economy. Because we uniquely realize that there's a hierarchy of right that exists, and therefore the top of the pyramid has to be the ability to disobey against harmful law that took away our civil liberties and our fundamental human rights to begin with. Before I move on to my second argument, I'll take a point.
All right, so does all forms of disobedience have to look like breaking a law on your side of the house?
We think that obviously for these individuals, there's going to be a set of different calculuses, but we believe that the ability to break the law is the ultimate safeguard that must exist. Anything else is arbitrary under their side. The second argument then on why there's an irreversibility of harm when unjust laws go into play. We know this already directly responds to that POI as well, insofar as we prove that any ability or any failure of their other mechanisms will lead towards irreversible harms towards individuals. We should always have one more alternative towards stopping that from happening. Two things. Firstly, the prolonging of unjust laws sets harmful legal precedents. The reason why this is true is twofold. One, because unjust laws cements privilege. This looks like Jim Crow laws cemented white privilege to the bare bones of America. The justification for more harmful laws to happen in the future. If we do not stop this one harmful legal precedent now, it meant the failure to pass all other just laws in the future. This was why uniquely the ability for immediate retaliation was more important under our side. But two, we let laws uniquely shape the moral compasses of people on the ground. The state apparatuses enforce unjust laws in all aspects, like media and education. This means that it don't only happens to a certain set of individuals. It happens throughout society, from the children to the elderly. Therefore, it is when you justify laws targeting LGBTQ individuals, you stop all ability for civil society to even care about those rights to begin with, because there was a chilling effect that came with every single unjust action that happened via the state. This means that if we prove that the state is unreliable in certain instances, they're unable to ever go against these instances at all. Secondly, the harm here is that unjust social engineering steps out all ability to resist against the state. This means that there's no inherent ability for people to ever work against the state under their side. If it is the case that there's going to be one corrupt government, that government was going to be the end of democracy and the end of all rights under their side. But secondly then, what's the weighing here? We have the recognition of the right to resist must exist regardless of the outcome and regardless of how people execute it, because we want to support the individual ability to go against it as a last form of safeguard. Everything under their side is up towards the debate on whether it is circumstantial at all instances, whether these laws are subjective or not. We believe that we don't risk the civil liberties on the individual to the arbitrariness of opposition's case. Proud to propose.
Thank you, first proposition, for the fine speech. Now I'd like to invite first opposition.
My name is Ellie Moy, pronouns she/her, and I take POIs verbally. My time starts on my first word. When everyone becomes their own judge of justice, the law stops protecting people and ends up instead starts collapsing under everyone's opinion. We'll explain why throughout opposition's case. First, going on to refutations, then framework, and then lastly, our contentions for today. So first, going over refutations. The first thing they talk about is how they have the right to protest against unjust laws. On our side of the debate, Judge, we say that peaceful protest happens on our side. We make it change, but in a way that doesn't include breaking the laws. We'll go over this more in our contentions. Second, they start defining unjust laws as laws that violate civil liberties of individuals as a whole of what society agrees on. However, we disagree with this definition. Rather, instead, we say that unjust laws are undefined, or rather, unjust laws depend on the individual's perspective and what they perceive unjust or not. We say that this is more reasonable than proposition's definition because unjust laws depend on one's perspective, as it can't be completely agreed on by everyone. So, the alternatives are peaceful protection, neither adhering nor breaking the law. Say, we protest peacefully for gay rights like what people did. We garner support, which then forces government to do changes around the people. So, when people pass unjust laws, we argue it's unjustifiable on an individual level. Even when there is a truly unjust law on a
Point.
fundamental level. No, thank you. Breaking it justifies change on a violent level. If killing people in order to change a law is justified, then under their side, they still get all the impacts of bloodshed. So, now moving on to their first contention. They start talking about social contract. We agree on this. We agree on social contract, but we disagree on the unfair state power. We say that democratic approaches to opposing a country's law always exist. We tell you that democratic approaches exist for the majority of the world's countries. So, when you stomp out peaceful protests, that's unjustifiable. When Navalny was executed in Russia, people started showing support by rallying behind them. So, next, they start talking about how people never consented to being born within the society. We say that this is true for anything. If the law of natural order dictates murder is justified, then people are allowed to break the law to do this of what they want to think. If they dislike their country and think their consent was not used, there are two options. One, they could either move out from the country, or two, they could oppose the government through democratic processes to achieve the law rights that they want. So, next, they start talking about how unjust laws set bad precedents. However, we say again there's democratic approaches. That's why we don't have bad precedents currently existing in the status quo, because people challenge it. For example, with a peaceful protest or with a petition. So, moreover, we flip this. We say that breaking a law you think is unjust actually sets a bad precedent instead. We go over this
Point.
in our convention as well. Yes?
LGBTQ individuals in Hungary are banned from peacefully expressing their identity. How is any peaceful protest ever able to safeguard their rights on your side?
Okay, to answer this, you don't need to have moreover, there are more options rather than just a peaceful protest, right? Say that you also have petitions, or you can speak up about it online on social media. In the end, that still rallies it against their own government. Moreover, for Hungary, it's their last option to break the law. It shouldn't be their first option instead. Okay, so now moving on to our framework. So what do we see on our framework? First, again, on unjust laws, we're making it undefined because it depends on the person's individual. So to frame our narrative here, Judge, if a law, for example, says that people should maintain a healthy, clean, and safe environment in their home, if someone thinks that this law is unjust based on their own perspective and decides not to follow this, proposition would support this type of action, while opposition would rather believe that people don't have a right to disobey this law, even if they think it's an unjust law. Rather than instead, they should use democratic processes such as having a peaceful protest or having a petition or speaking up about it online. So what does it mean to disobey? That means if there is something truly immoral, the way to protest and change is through neutrality, and you also have to go through democratic. It's actively breaking the law perceived by the unjust and actively protesting against the unjust law. So we must point this out. We don't think that you should sit there and tolerate a truly bad law, but we do think that the immediate decision-making calculus involved in that does not deem illegal action worthy and righteous. You do have the right to protest, but not the right to break the law. Rights are entitlement granted by legal, moral, or societal frameworks. They do not necessarily
Point.
require moral approval, but no thank you. They simply define what individuals are allowed to do or have in every scenario, something that you shall never take away. So, what is the burden here? The burden here is that you as an individual have a burden to protect yourself as well as society. So what proposition has to prove here on today's debate? That they won't have a chaotic side and they won't have a chaotic world on their side of the debate, just like on what we're seeing on their burden on ours. So first, going over our contention. Our first contention, therefore, talks about inconsistency. Our premise here is that we've already defined that an unjust law is very blurry and is solely based on the moral distinctions in society at that period of time. And it is also based on an individual's moral values. So what is the characterization here? Proposition simply says, if I disagree with a law and if I call it immoral, I can break the law. This is highly encouraging of self-determined illegal actions. This looks like a radical conspiracy theorist trying to uncover a deep state by causing trouble to lure them out. This isn't protesting, Judge. This is simply doing illegal actions. Bad actors can particularly capitalize off of this because they can deem anything immoral, and proposition would always give them that because they believe that it's a right to do illegal things. So, what do we see on side opposition? We tell you that it is not an innate human right to simply break the law when you disagree with the moral value of a law itself. So, what are the impacts? First, we see that we have increased extremism because you can exploit this, right? Second, we have the erosion of the justice system because suddenly now you can just break the law due to the rights that proposition thinks you can have. And third, we have the collapse of legality. So, going on to our second contention. Our second contention is us saying that it's better to take a democratic alternative. So, our premise here is that democratic movements are far more effective than individual acts of disobedience in addressing unjust laws. Here's our characterization. First, laws are not static, Judge. This is the case for many countries in the world, basically most and all. They are designed to change and evolve through voting, judicial review, and etc., not through breaking laws. So because of this, we have democratic approaches such as going to court, having a petition, protest elections, and etc. These processes are collective peacemakers rather than an individual or a crowd of people disobeying and causing chaos in society. So because of this, there are a majority of successful protests that don't break the law. For example, the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. and hundreds of thousands of people were marching down, which therefore led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or just Greta Thunberg's climate strikes, which helped spark global climate conversation. So, as long as there is media or the news, a movement can grow while being 100% pacifist. Two, disobedience causes chaos on moral reasoning. When people disobey based on what they think is unjust, you set a precedent where anyone can opt out of the law, not because it's unjust in a societal sense, but just because an individual feels like it is. So, this therefore affects many vulnerable groups, such as marginalized communities, as they rely on anti-discrimination laws, labor laws, housing and voting laws, which are considered rights, to therefore protect their own rights and freedom. So, on proposition, people's freedoms and protections are actively being taken away of in the process of disobeying laws that people think are unjust. Therefore, vote for opposition. Thank you.
I think to the first opposition for the fine speech. To respond the case, invite second prompt.
When Rosa Parks decided she would not give up her seat for a white man on the bus simply because she was black, she broke segregation laws in the United States of America. That was the beginning of the civil rights movement, not just a random protest that spun out of nowhere. The reality that this opposition needs to contend with is that we live in a world where a lot of states decide to delve into fascism and oppress their citizens. They cannot just debate on the premise of a fair and fully democratic state. Two issues then in my speech. First, on good laws and what happens. Three issues, sorry. Second, on legal channels. And lastly, on why, even at the worst case scenario, we say that having it as a last resort is the most justified stance within this debate. Let's first talk about good laws in this debate, because this opposition wants to claim that the majority of people would break reasonable and just laws because laws were simply because the justness of a law was simply subjective. First of all, I don't think the justness of a law is simply subjective, even on an individual level. I, as a rational human being, like the majority of the people in this room, can recognize that the law that bans killing is there to protect my freedom to be able to live without fear. But secondly, and more importantly, even if they claim that the fringe minority of people would break laws willy-nilly based on their whims, We say this is absolutely symmetric because the reality is that this opposition's main harm is that people will commit crimes for no reason. But here are three structural reasons that those incentives to commit crime would exist symmetrically on the side of opposition. One is that it could be influenced by their upbringing, which means that people who don't receive enough love as kids end up becoming serial killers or whatever. Two, they could have mental and emotional instability. And three, it could simply be a matter of circumstance where they grow up in places that are not strategic or they are unable to defend themselves otherwise. This means that people are symmetrically going to commit crimes on the side of opposition, which means now I have taken out their largest attack in this debate. The debate therefore has to become about just laws and the ability to justify breaking them when you feel oppressed. The second issue then on legal channels, and here's where I want to reframe this debate, right? Because truly, opposition, if legal channels worked or existed, then people would have opted for them anyway, which means this debate is about breaking the law as a last resort when legal channels simply do not exist or do not work anymore. The reason for this is simple, is that if you as a minority are suffering under state oppression and you could have chosen to fight in court and it worked, you would have done so because doing otherwise would risk social exclusion. Doing otherwise could risk the state cracking down on your community. For all of these reasons, it's clear legal channels were always the first resort. This debate is about justifying breaking laws as the last resort then. Two things under here then. Firstly, that unjust laws are symptomatic of fascist states, which means that the democratic processes that this opposition says that we forgo simply no longer exist anymore. We point to multiple examples in this debate which they are unwilling to contest with. Hungary literally banning the ability to wave a rainbow flag and cracking down on gay expression within their country. The destruction of peaceful protests in Russia when this Russian state keeps cracking down on every single person who wanted to work for Alexei Navalny, and even the Jim Crow laws in the United States that literally prevented Black people from being part of the check and balance process in the democratic system because they were not eligible to vote. All of this means that the democratic processes that opposition wants us to use are being cut out systematically by the existence of unjust laws. Therefore, going forth in this debate, they cannot debate in a world where we can suddenly access legal channels. They needed to prove to us why, absent of legal channels, it was still unjustified for people to break unjust laws. But secondly, and more importantly, let's be charitable. Even if legal channels existed on the side of proposition, why do we still think it is justified for people to break laws in the first place? For two reasons, right? One is that legal channels take a very long time, which means at best, your quickest solution to Hungary's 4 years of crackdown on gay expression and gay individuals would take a whole election cycle. And that is if Viktor Orban doesn't decide to change the term limits again. And secondly, and more importantly, was that the longer you have the law in place, the more likely you are to socially engineer society into accepting that it is legitimate for a few reasons, right? First, that the state generally has legitimacy, but secondly, you create a culture of silence because the chilling effect of a state that is willing to crack down on people shows to people that we must bow down to this state, otherwise we fear being persecuted next, which means that when less and less people are willing to speak out against issues and less people feel safe to speak out against issues, even if democratic processes did technically exist, nobody would opt for it anyway because nobody was willing to stand up against the state in the most truest way by breaking the law that they saw was unjust. But lastly, and more importantly then, on the third issue of why we believe that it is simply just justified and they cannot take this down. Notice, panel, the entirety of O1's argumentation relies on outcome. It relies on the possibility of misuse, but they refuse to engage in the most truest of instances where unjust laws are broken, when the state is deliberately cracking down on people or when the state is deliberately taking away opportunities for it to access legal channels in the first place. We gave you three metrics coming from first proposition to absolutely no response. We told you first that there's a power asymmetry in the social contract the minute the state creates an unjust law, because now the state is able to utilize any and all state apparatus to crack down on dissent. Secondly, we told you that it was just simply an extension of your freedom of expression because going against anti-sedition laws, going against anti-riot laws, or even just contending with American government when it comes to the Alien Enemies Acts, all of these were like extensions of your ability to express yourself and express your anger towards the state that is willing to crack down on you other ways. The reality was that every time they say that people should go out and protest, they're asking people to put themselves in the face of danger because you're not willing to take the hardest stance when it comes to contesting against the government. Imagine telling a bunch of immigrants to go out and protest against ICE when ICE is there to kidnap them all away and send them to El Salvador. That is the kind of world that they need to defend. But the deadlock breaker here is that if in some cases it is weird, if in some cases it is wrong to break a law because they claim it is subjective, and in some cases that it was truly justified to break a law because it truly was unjustified, we say we would rather prioritize and weigh over the instances in which people break laws for valid reasons because of true violations of civil liberties than we do over the fringe instances where people kill other people for fun. And this is for two reasons. That one, the people who are suffering under really unjust laws have to suffer for the next, like, unjust laws will set legal precedents that make it even harder for them to fight for it through legal channels in the future. But secondly, and more importantly, that these were the most vulnerable actors within the debate, that these are the people that are constantly being locked out of the democratic system, being locked out of being able to hold the state accountable, and more importantly, being locked out of the ability to be served as a true citizen where the state protects their interests. The comparative then is that even in fringe instances where people break laws willy-nilly, we take that trade-off because firstly and more importantly, how do you know people are breaking laws willy-nilly? Maybe you shot an ICE officer because you were scared he was going to deport you back to El Salvador. Maybe Julian Assange was threatening national security, but he was exposing years and years of US injustice and breaking the Geneva Convention when it came to US interference, which meant then because the subjectiveness of a just law, because the just law was subjective, we would rather a world where the people who had full autonomy, rational people who had full autonomy and understanding of what was most morally proximate to them, were able to decide that and therefore take autonomy over their lives. For all those reasons, propose.
Thank you. Second proposition for the fine speech. I'd like to invite second op.
All right, my speech will begin on my first word, verbal POIs, please. Panel, when you justify law breaking for the greater good, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Everyone's view is unique, so in this case, when you stand up for something you believe in, you should do it in a civil manner because it means you can't be punished for it. For this reason, so proud to oppose. So, as the second speaker on side opposition, I'll be doing two things for you today. Firstly, I'll be going through some refutation and reconstruction of side proposition before moving on to one unique contention on chaotic world order. Moving on to some refutation, the first example they bring up is Rosa Parks. Firstly, our response is that we don't say that Rosa Parks isn't not justified, right? We still say that Rosa Parks was justified in what they do, but there's always an alternative. Putting yourself at risk is not the solution. Note that you can rally people without committing a crime, and it was the bus boycott that truly changed legislature. It wouldn't have been different if Rosa Parks had simply inspired people through speaking out about it, because in that way, it was still peaceful, it wasn't breaking the law, but still accomplished the same thing. Secondly, they say that a law to ban killing is there to let me live without fear. They forget that individuals view unjust things differently. If I believe that living naturally in the wilderness is the best way to stop climate change, then I can justify murder of animals to protect the climate. Same way, this isn't different. I don't see where they're pulling this from. They also bring up that our biggest point is that committing crime is for no reason. They say that people are rational to tell unjust versus just, but the thing is, the reason why people don't opt for legal channels first is because people don't always see the first choice. They don't treat breaking the law as a last choice, but rather a first because they have that choice under opposition. Side proposition cannot make this, cannot just assume that everybody knows exactly what they need to do every single time, because the majority of time you simply do not know what necessarily is the correct solution. People are not rational human beings in every case. We cannot define what is rational in every time period. We have a definition on what is rational based on the moral values we have in today's society. Today's morals are not the same moral values as before. That's why some people may think a law is unjust and others may think it is just. Not everyone is brought up with the same exact values, as proposition even claims that there are fascist values in society and upbringing differs. Moving on, they talk about Jim Crow laws, they talk about how there's check and balance processes. But the thing is, with the comparative, there's also George Floyd. It was unjust for the police officer to effectively murder him when he had effectively not done anything wrong. It's not based on rule breaking, but the scenario you're in. It's comparatively better, we say, if you're not put in harm's way, because at least the state is not justified to touch you, or for example, go against your rules, your rights in any way. So, moving on, the law isn't built to trust intentions. It's built to prevent harm. You don't write laws assuming perfect behavior. The moment you give everyone a legal
POI.
right to disobey, you're also giving it to irrational, malicious, and extremist actors too. Just because some people use disobedience irresponsibly doesn't mean it's safe or justified to hand that power over to everyone. For example, the January 6th rioters who stormed the Capitol. All right, moving on to my contention on a chaotic world order, but before I continue, I'll take that POI.
The US Supreme Court ordered the Trump administration to bring back Abrigo Garcia, but they refused. Do you still think US citizens should comply with laws that mandate they give up information of their migrant colleagues?
Okay, the difference between that, right, is that sure, in some cases you might be legally upheld to tell the truth, but in a lot of the cases, there are still alternatives, right? There's the alternative of boycotting. There's the alternative of when you're not legally upheld, you can simply just ignore people. It doesn't matter what scenario it is because there's always alternatives. It's unfeasible for you to say that there's simply a world where nothing is possible. No, everything that you do constitutes a rule breaking. So, moving on to my contention, by utilizing chaos, you effectively break down the fundamental laws of society. 4 points of characterization here. Firstly, chaos is the worst form of rebellion. When you riot in the streets, that's the worst form of rebellion because not only is it illegal, it can eventually break down into chaos. The moment people stop following laws, they encourage others to follow suit. The mindset behind this is that they can't arrest all of us, therefore we should descend into chaos. However, this always fails in the long term. When you start justifying stealing bread to fund a noble rebellion or killing others because you believe in what's right, this happens on both worlds and sides. It means that the other side is justified as well when they clap back. Secondly, this breaks down the fundamental rules of society in pursuit of something greater. Chaos accomplishes nothing, rather it heightens the stakes because if you lose, laws don't apply to you anymore. Wars happen because they justify bloodshed with more bloodshed in pursuit of what is just. A chaotic world is a bad world, and we would rather support neutrality and passive-aggressive stances, leading on to my third point, which is when we strive for a world like this, it becomes more irredeemable for the state to gun you down. Again, as I've said before, it's justifiable for censorship when you can be passed off as a threat to society if you break a law. Furthermore, on our side, this is better because we gain more followers and can change more than chaos ever will. Through peaceful protests, for example, it doesn't ostracize people. When you riot, people don't support you because you're radical. You're not someone that they can trust because you do things that break the law. When you go and fight for what's right in a civilized manner, that's when you gain everyone's approval. That's when you actually get more people on your side because now you maintain a stance that everybody agrees in. So this leads on to two worlds. Firstly, there's a world in which you stand up for a peaceful protest, for example, and it goes unchallenged. Therefore, you gather supporters, you're able to change society, you're able to change legislature because more people are on your side as a whole. In the second world, where you're attacked or censored because you're part of a peaceful protest, this still doesn't change because it still inspires people to stand up because it's unjustifiable. Note that this is the same thing as Rosa Parks, but instead of putting yourself in danger, you're forcing the government to effectively either attack you, and therefore it leads to you becoming a martyr, and it leads to people actually rallying behind you, or they leave you alone and you're still able to change society. We see that this is better because it means that you're not put in harm's way. So what is the comparative on side proposition? Even if they argue nothing can be changed except through breaking laws, this still isn't true. Society is in the eyes of the people. When you peacefully protest, you neither break nor adhere to the law and force it to change around you. What we argue is that people shape society, not society shapes them. Already, it's self-correcting when countries know people will always find a way to protest against them. And even in the case of dictators, it's unfeasible to assume every form of resistance must be illegal. In the same way, that means that you cannot break the law. Governments cannot touch you when you don't do anything warranting a criminal sentence, for example. Moving on to our impacts then. Firstly, we get less chaos and less bloodshed. Any rule breaking that you do can easily be justified under side proposition to throw you in prison. This doesn't accomplish anything because it puts you in harm's way and radicalizes the people in the very best scenario. This leads to things such as the Reign of Terror, where when Marat was killed and basically acted as a martyr for the people, it just led to people losing their values and what it truly meant for the French Revolution to happen. Secondly, we uphold the fundamental rules of society and make it easier to recover. War leads way into war. When you fight a war for the greater good, even if you win, the outcome isn't good. This leads to war zones. This leads to people who are caught in the crossfire, who are forced to steal. What we say is when you actually change laws through legislature, it means that none of this happens. It doesn't perpetuate any problems in the future. For this reason, I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you. Second opposition for the fine speech. Not like to invite third prop.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay. The conception of opposition is remarkably shallow in this round, because notably, their conception explains that resistance or miscompliance of a law constitutes choice. But we question from the side of proposition that Rosa Parks really had a choice when she chose to sit on these segregationist seats when she was the first victim was violated by the state in the first place. Did the people who lived under colonial rule agree and consent to the choices made by the colonizers? And if not, why ought they not resist? Did the people who lived under apartheid laws in South Africa agree to it? And if not miscompliance, what alternatives and what freedom do they have? Importantly, the women consent to having their bodily autonomy manipulated by the state's paternalistic stances when Roe v. Wade was overruled. The conception at the end of this round is that we are the side that has a more rich conception of what the real world problems are, and resistance is justified in some cases, which is why we all protect the right to disobey laws. I want to first have two broad observations at the top of his speech. The first is second opposition's blatant conception of defending Rosa Parks and their ability and Rosa Parks' actions might be justified in some cases is fatal towards their case. It is inherently contradictory because it pretty much concedes and submits to every single argumentation that we've made in this round. The reason is why it is justified for that resistance to happen was because the state was inherently oppressive from the start. It was the state who took away her liberties for that woman and for that LGBTQ person who never had any conception of choice, who have never had any forms of conception to live in that country. But the second observation I'd like to note is that the entirety of opposition's case thus far has been banked on that we have to violate and break the law in our side of the house, and we will note that it's a pure misconception of what this all being an unjust law means on our side of the house. I have three things to say underneath this. The first is, notably, it purely means not obeying that specific law in precise, i.e. you're able to opt out of that law, but it never meant that you were able to opt out and resort to other worse off alternatives in the pursuit of that law. For example, in resistance, what we supported on our side of house was not Rosa Parks killing the police officers, but rather just her sitting at the place in that seat that was designated for white people in that regard. It never meant that you needed to kill the officer. You could just choose to not surrender to that precise law, not submit yourself, your IDs, for example. But secondly, notably, this is an unrealistic characterization that we're pushing because there were already external penalties under both sides of the house to mitigate against violence. So even if this conception is flawed, it is unclear as why people will be that irrational in opting into these kinds of unfair and violent pursuits at the end of the day. This observation matters because opposition's case and all of the harms of breaking their laws no longer apply on our side of house. It was a pure misconception of what we defined from the start. We purely defended the right of opting out of a specific law, not the violation of other laws and other civil liberties. With that being said, I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. First of all, in principle, is this right justifiable? And second of all, on the consequentialist considerations on which side of the house is better off on societal outcomes. First of all, is this right principally justified in a vacuum? We give you three reasons from first, still not meaningfully engaged with at this point, as why the disproportionate or the power asymmetry of the social contract that is established innately justifies this. First of all, we know that a state has the ability to control state apparatuses in the likes of the media. The state has the ability to, for example, mobilize the military. The state has the ability to imprison individuals in confines. But second of all of opposition's alternatives at best were reactionary, which meant that it necessitated violence for people to respond, which means that in this equation innately, the people already hold less rights compared to the state. But thirdly, people never consented to the concept of the state to begin with. The overwhelming strategy from opposition in response to this was to suggest that there are other ways to pursue the civil liberties or to pursue rights in our side of the house that does not constitute violating the law in the likes of peaceful protests. I'd rally three responses to this. First of all, this clearly does not engage with the first and the second point of our argumentation. Notably, even if peaceful protests are possible, it is futile if the state has control over the media. Even if re-elections are possible, it is futile if the state in their ruling period in their 4 years have already cemented so much power that it's practically impossible for another ruling party as an alternative to come back. That in state elections, they had more resources. They were always at the upper hand. And secondly, they never responded to the fact that this is reactive at best. But second, notably, this response at best proved alternatives to our case, but notably, disobeying the law and all the alternatives inherently inherit the same characteristics, which is resistance against the state. So principally, both of these their alternatives and our proposal are symmetric in principle, which is why this response in precise does not disprove or does not prove whether the right to resistance or the right to disobey the law does not exist on our side. Third, those alternatives were never mutually exclusive on our side of the house. The only meaningful difference is what happens when those alternatives do not work. In response from opposition, we heard silence. We told you, in those circumstances, it was meaningful to have this resistance because it not only meant signaling resistance, it meant actual resistance for your rights. It meant voicing out when your sexuality is violated, when your civil liberties are infringed upon, when you yourself was disfavored at a state that was so powerful with no alternatives. Notably, at this point, therefore, even if there is some utilization of violence on our side of the house, I would weigh why social utility in the creation of less violence on their side always came inferior to this principle that we note in three ways. First of all, we told you from first in the response that notably states never absolutely care about utility because the extension of that logic is dangerous and is hazardous. It meant that a state could prioritize utility maximization pursuits in all instances. That would mean we will ask opposition, is it okay to just jail and imprison everyone and make everyone work 24/7 for the state? Because that is where utility maximization is materialized at its peak. The question is no, and that's where our case stands. But second, utility is deemed disproportionate, i.e. the decrease in violence on their side of the house, and that benefit in precise is disproportionately in place across different people across the board. That is to say, minorities are the one who likely suffer significantly on their side of the house. But the third weighing is note. On net, we're the side that reduces more violence in the long term, and violence occurs more on their side of the house. Because notably, this violence doesn't just mean it's not one-sided, i.e. it is not just people protesting against the state, it is also the state impositioning its values on people. So on their side of the house, minorities continue to suffer. That is also violence. So on net, our side of the house, with this right in present, is what reduces that violence from the start, which is all that we create less violence at the end of the day. Before I talk about the second question, I'll take a POI if there's any. 3, 2, 1. They refuse to engage. Simon questioned that, but even if the principle isn't a consideration in this round, which side creates better social utility with or without the recognition of this right? We explained two things from first that received minimal responses. But even then, the only thing they were able to claim in this argumentation was to suggest one, that people are irrational, and second of all, that there are massive different conceptions across the board on irrationality that came out from second opposition. One, it is unclear why people will be irrational when they literally have to put their lives at stake protesting in the streets. The point is, any forms of resistance or any forms of dissent in the state necessitates a cost that often might involve your life, or if anything, putting your life at risk, which is why it is unclear why people irrationally opt into it. But second, this is offensive at best because it tells Rosa Parks that her decision was purely irrational. It tells minorities who are protesting in the streets for their literal civil liberties that they are fundamentally irrational human beings. I don't think that this point works. But on their point about how all of us have different conceptions and therefore it will create a lot of chaos. First of all, this is intuitively not true, because even if we have different conceptions, we are influenced by the same society or the same values. That is why, even if people have different conceptions, most of their thoughts fall on the general categorization of the school of thoughts in the status quo. For example, if you're a Republican or a Democrat. But second of all, this does not negate our claim that notably resistance is still viable and is still justified on our side of the house, insofar as there is a greater propensity for people to make change at the end of the day. For all of those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you. Third proposition for the fine speech. Next to third op.
All right, am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Caden, he, him pronouns, and assuming everybody is ready with verbal POIs, time will begin on my next word. What makes something a right? Universality. We read this in our first early on, and they just didn't engage on proving it all on our grounds. They lack ground on our case. They run a pure defense. Universality is the main metric for what a right is. Even if they never made the mistake of forgetting the framework, we can still win, because the trade-off for bloodshed is something you cannot afford. We would say, let's look at the individual. For your average person in a world where it is a right, it means that even if there was an objectively immoral law that was clearly observed at that time, you recklessly put yourself on the line. There's no trial on error when someone's life is on the line. The agenda for today's speech is going to look like framing, two clashes, and then at the end, we're going to characterize and summarize why you vote for the opposition ballot. Firstly is on framing. They want to give you examples on the info dump, and let's talk about that. Firstly, they told you how it's principally justified, and they keep proving it to you. They keep trying to prove to you that it's principally justified. We do say, yes, it is principally justified to rebel against something that isn't right, but we don't say it is a right. Because something is principally justified, it doesn't automatically make it a human right for you to have like a legal action in protest of something, because they still can't engage with the argumentation of different people have different interpretations. That alone, though, Rosa Parks not surrendering to that law is still an extreme that we wouldn't tell the next guy to do. We didn't tell her, we won't tell her that it is irrational, but we wouldn't say that it's applicable to every other scenario in which is what a law is. We told you on Kantian ethics in which it was the rule of universality in which it was to prove something was a right. Rosa Parks doesn't surrender to that law, is still an extreme, and keep it there. But if we apply it to anywhere else, it's not a good first trigger. Now on to question number one. Can protests evolve without illegal actors? Later, please. We told you that using democratic methods is still a good framework. We also told you that our stance was using illegal means was not right, where you were entitled to do so. A right must be able to be exercised at any time, but it is wrong to exercise this hypothetical right when there are still other options. It is a last lever because the disobeyment is way too high of a risk and low probability of return. In of itself, the universality in which someone simply disagrees with a law and they deem it themselves as immoral, then you would say that they have the right to exercise their own ability to disobey the law. This is completely false because you have to defend that scenario to make it a right. This is also the way that every other right in like human nature is established. because it is universal. They said that, and they gave you the info dump on examples like Hungary with the dictatorship. They info dump on Rosa Parks, which, by the way, didn't start the movement. There were protests before that. Don't put these protests down. They're part of the platform for Rosa Parks. That's also why MLK was already on the scene before Rosa Parks did move from her seat. But anyway, back to the info dump. If you're going to talk about Hungary with the dictatorship, let's look at the individual level. Because another thing a right has to do is also has to be beneficial to the person exercising that right. And in this scenario, it isn't, because you're automatically going to be cut down. In any dictatorship scenario in which you didn't like it and everything was basically illegal, yes, it is true. The only way to rebel is to do something illegal, but we don't think it is a right because that rebellion actively leads your own rebellion to be shut down. It is instantly cut off, not only just your neck, but also your ideas. Now, we prevail in any scenario on this clash because we tell you can doubt a law. Later, please. You can doubt the governmental structure. This is the right to protest, but we don't think that there is a right to disobey legislation on every single person. It is not a right. You have to prove it for everybody to use it as the first trigger to prove that it is entitlement to the person. Before I move on to the next clash, I'll take a few.
So the right to choice also has exclusions and is not inconsistent. For example, you can't choose to kill other people because it infringes on our civil liberties. By extension of your logic, would you also propose to abolish the right to choice for all?
We never said abolish the right to choice for all, because there is another choice. There is another choice in which you can do something that isn't illegal. Even if you said there's no probability in which a government can make every single action illegal, that is not possible. This is why even during the Holocaust, there were forms of protest that didn't result in people getting executed, going to jail, going to retraining camps. Moving on to the second clash, if it was a human right, what changes? We told you democratic approaches were big. Rosa Parks is so important because she started the peaceful movement. We don't think that a legal movement is the first movement. And are you entitled to break a law? Is it good for you? Because again, to exercise the right, it must be good for the person. That's the second fence they must hop over. It's not good if you're cut down instantly. No, thank you. What they told you, though, is that it makes it viable for those in dictatorship because they have no other mechanism that isn't illegal, because now everything is illegal. We're giving a lot of ground here because, again, as I told you, there's no such thing as where every single action is illegal. That's fascism and authoritarianism, right, at its worst. Well, we prevail because this also looks like being shut down. Even for North Korea, the simplest illegal actions lead to your death. The government has no power to do so. We think it's even worse for encouraging protest when you're simply 100% cut down. They gave you the example of like shooting an ICE officer in self-defense, but that's even more off-putting for those that are trying to protest, because not only does it result in like something that will actively harm you, but it will also result in just putting off of what you think is good forms of protest. Because when you think that is good, when you think it's the first trigger, but it like results in such a high risk and such a low return on most case scenarios, then it shows protesters that is inefficient, that you shouldn't do anything there. That is bad for the nature of protesting. Anything soft power you can do is bad. We would rather victims just survive than die meaningless. We're not saying these people are meaningless as alive, no thank you, but we're saying that what they're trying to do is not going to add any value to themselves. What are you trying to do? You're trying to save your own scenario because the people have to save themselves, but you're not saving yourself when you're still dying and people are just instantly shut down. Dictatorships don't care. Just like the Great Terror of the French Revolution, they didn't care how many counts of people were cut down. They didn't care how many people they put on the guillotine, because it didn't change anything for a dictatorship government. Now, on to the characterization. Let's summarize what our side looks like. We aren't telling you that protest is bad. We think protest is a right. We don't think that illegal action meets the requirements of a right. We make things right based off of this benchmark. There is a standard that proposition has to reach. After all, they want it to be considered a human right, but when two of the main gates you must bypass aren't even open for breaking a law being entitled in your ability, you aren't entitled to breaking a law, you're entitled to protest. They give you all the extremities in which we have refuted, and we are tired of giving them so much ground. But they cannot just refute your average Joe anyway, because it's not just those oppressed and hungry, it's your neighbor that doesn't like the new legislator imposed by City Hall. You must approve, and you also must impose it on every single other scenario too. Ultimately, proposition must prove that if it fits a right, complying in universality and confirmed benefit for the exerciser. Simply because they cannot prove that law breaking meets it, it is bad, in some cases does not mean all. The truth. They must defend the all, and even after we give them so much ground. For these reasons, you oppose.
I think to the third opposition for the fine speech, and that's conclude for the substantive speech for this round. Now I'd like to invite up reply. Sure.
The speech will begin on my first word. Panel, when you break the law and you believe is for the greater good, the opposing side can believe this too. When you go and you rob a store because you believe it allows you to achieve your goal, the opposing side can choose to detain you as well. For this reason, I'm so proud to oppose. Three things I'd like to do in today's speech then. Firstly, I'll be going through some clarifications of today's round before moving on to addressing two themes. Firstly, on justification, and secondly, on rule to change. Firstly, on the clarifications, I'd like to point out it's unfeasible for proposition to rule that in any scenario, you must break the law to access change. When Rosa Parks broke the law, it could have accessed the same exact impacts if she had simply inspired people through gatherings and movements instead. Secondly, they cannot assume that lawbreaking is always the last choice and it'll always be justified. People inherently share different viewpoints and people aren't entirely rational. What this means is that you're never going to consider every single scenario before actually going and breaking the law. It means that you're likely to break the law first because you have this choice. All right, moving on to my first theme on justification then, I'd like to point out what proposition says. What they say is that breaking a law should always be an option. Through our entire bench, what we've told you is that what this constitutes is when you fight and break the law, it justifies the government to clap back. When you protest violently or break the law, that gives the state the ability to hurt you because it's viewed as justification. When proposition said that the state has the ability to mobilize their military in third, they have already agreed with us. Note that this justification is only on their side. Unarmed, law-breaking protesters can still be gunned down with the justification being a threat to the government. We think that it should be a part of your arsenal, but not your primary mean. When we don't break the law, the choice for the state to gun us down disappears. We told you this leads to two worlds. A, you continue speaking out and garner enough people to challenge the legislature democratically. Note that states shape around the people. Even if we take their analysis, that murder being illegal is to protect us, they already defend us by admitting the main responsibility of the state is for them to protect you. Even in cases of dictators, the people are still a majority, they're still a force that can change laws peacefully. Moving on to weighing then, in their best case, that justification exists and they do this in the worst case, it still fails because when you break a law, you wage war against the government. If justification falls down to the individual, then it doesn't matter how noble you are if the government has the same choice as you. If you break the law, the government can clap back. There's no point in protesting if it means losing your life and limb. And in the best case scenario, you do change something, it creates radicality, not inspiration. Secondly, on rule to change, again, it's not feasible for proposition to assume that everything is completely impossible on our side. We can never access the benefits of their side because obviously alternatives exist. We've listed them out for you. We've told you about boycotting. We've told you about not necessarily adhering to the law, but not necessarily breaking them. We've told you about loopholes. We've told you about peaceful protest. Even if we take the trade-off of having maybe slower change and legislature, we still win because this prevents bloodshed. I'd happily take this if it means that more people are on our side in net, and it means that I'm able to prevent all the war zones and all the crossfires in between. You create opposition when you break laws, even if it means changing things slowly. This just means more chance for us to garner support, and therefore more people support them on net. Moving on to weighing then, in the best case that they change faster, they change better, I'd still like to address the trade-off on their side. Best case, people still oppose you, you ostracize certain groups, and people will still oppose you after laws have been passed. It's up to the people to decide what's good and bad, and when we change that through peace, we ultimately make it a better good. Moving on, worst case, they still perpetuate problems. Change will lead to radicality. The aftermath will be bad when people suffer. What we want is for people to want to change the law because you're inspired and you believe it's unjust. We don't want it when you're fueled by radicality and anger because that always spirals into a downfall and you lose sight of what you truly held dear. For this reason, so proud to oppose.
Thank you. I'll reply for the fine remarks, not like to invite prop reply.
The unanswered question that we have asked opposition time and time again is, how do you boycott ICE? How do I boycott the Trump administration? And how on earth am I supposed to boycott the Ayatollah in Iran? The framing here is clear, that if legal alternatives were available and were not shut down, we would have used them anyway. 3 things in my speech then. First, on legal channels. Second, on justification. And lastly, quickly, on misuse. Firstly then, do legal channels exist? Note panel, this is the most important point in this debate because opposition themselves made the concession that it is only unjustified to break the law. It is only justified to break the law when there is no other choice available. So if I can prove to you in this speech how in this debate we have shown there are no other legal alternatives, we take the debate on the opposition's metrics. The framing here is simple, right? If people existed, if legal channels existed and worked, people would opt for them anyway for reasons of safety, for reasons of fearing social exclusion. This opposition cannot just say people want to take it as a first resort because the amount of state punishment that comes with it is simply too far to justify, which means that if there was an alternative, it would have happened anyway. But more importantly, this debate was about states that used unjust laws to lock people out of democratic processes and legal alternatives. This looks like Iran, where blasphemy laws make it literally illegal to criticize the Ayatollah or the Iranian state in any single way, which meant that every time people came out to peacefully protest, they arrested the protesters, put them in jail, and killed their family members. In USA, even post-Reconstruction, where people were supposedly more democratic, Jim Crow laws locked Black people out of the democratic process altogether because they literally could not vote. How on earth then can we expect this opposition to run a case when they say they want you to hold them accountable through democratic processes when unjust laws were the first things that cut them out? The end of this is clear. Opposition has failed to prove a legal alternative in every single instance. Insofar as we prove in some instances that when legal alternatives don't exist, the harms are far too severe and we must break the law, we have already taken the debate then. Second question on the ability to justify it. And this is where opposition makes an interesting claim. First, they say the justification is outcome-based, which is to say that if it causes further crackdowns, it is unjustified. Firstly, I'd like to point out that this opposition seems to live in a very interesting world where oppressive states don't crack down on people regardless of descent, which means that people were already likely being discriminated against. Let's be real. Before Rosa Parks sat down in that bus, they were already pushing Black people out of spaces because they said you are separate and not separate but equal. And more importantly, this debate isn't about outcome. If you read the motion clearly, it is about whether or not it is fair for a person who is being discriminated against by an unjust law to break it, which means opposition's burden in this debate was never to prove to us change, even though they couldn't anyway. They needed to prove to us why it was okay to look an immigrant in the eye and tell them that you must comply by the law and give yourselves up to ICE when they want to deport you. But second metric they bring up here is about the universality of rights and consistency, which is very easily taken down, and we already have done so, right? P3 clearly tells you that even if we don't have choice in all instances, we recognize the importance of choice and autonomy as fundamental human rights anyway, which means then, even if we can't break laws in all instances, we say in instances where it's justified because it's unjust, therefore the right should exist. But more importantly, the one main prop contention that opposition refused to engage with is what was debate winning, because we proved to you there is no point in abiding by the social contract and following a law when the state broke that social contract by refusing to serve your interests. We told you very clearly, if the American state now failed to protect its people, the people had a right to dissent, the people had a right to no longer abide by the social contract and therefore break the law. But lastly and very quickly on misuse, this is where we want to trade it off, right? We say likely crimes are going to happen anyway because people want to kill people regardless of a moral justification. More importantly, it only happens in a fringe minority of instances. We have to focus on the bigger picture here, which are the people who are oppressed.
Thank you, proposition, for the fine remarks. That's also marked the end of the debate for this round. Thank you so much, everyone, for a great debate. Congratulations as well for finishing these competitions. So you can just wait for the next announcement from the Oracle. For the judges, let's move to room 2 for the deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you for the debate.
Thank you.
Thank you for the debate. You guys were awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.